Why do some nations, when they're backed into a corner, choose peace while others choose war? It is one of the most important questions in the world, right? Today, we're going to unpack this really fascinating theory that tried to answer it. And get this, it made a high-stakes prediction that went spectacularly wrong. And in doing so, it revealed a much deeper truth about the logic of conflict and cooperation. Okay, let's get into it.
So let's just start with that fundamental question. What is it that pushes a nation over the edge? Is it opportunity, a simple lust for power, or is it something else entirely? Something maybe a little more primal?
Well, one powerful idea is something called need-driven aggression. And the theory is not about strength, it's actually about weakness. It suggests that leaders don't lash out when they feel powerful, but when they feel desperate. When they're facing threats at home or from abroad that they just can't seem to solve directly.
Now, what's really interesting here is how this slide breaks down that sense of desperation. It's not just one thing, right? It could be a foreign threat, like that feeling of being surrounded by rivals. Or it could be a domestic threat, like a totally failing economy or political unrest. And then there's reputation, this fear that if you don't act tough, your enemies will see you as weak, and maybe even worse, your allies will just abandon you. This all seems pretty intuitive, doesn't it? A cornered animal lashes out. But here's where our story takes a really sharp turn. Back in the 1980s, this very theory was put to the ultimate test, and it led to a massive prediction about the fate of the world's two superpowers. So the scholar behind this theory looked at the landscape in 1980. He saw these growing internal and external pressures on both the US and the USSR, and based on his theory, he forecasted a really dangerous decade of rising tension and, potentially, conflict. And wow, this slide just brilliantly illustrates the result. The prediction for the United States, it was spot on. The U.S., under Reagan, facing economic frustration, absolutely became more assertive, with a huge military buildup. But for the Soviet Union, which was under even greater pressure, the prediction failed completely. I mean, totally wrong. Instead of lashing out, it became incredibly conciliatory, ultimately leading to the end of the Cold War. So this is the central puzzle, isn't it? The theory worked for one superpower, but not the other. Why on earth did the country with every single reason to be aggressive, according to the model, suddenly extend an olive branch? The answer, as it turns out, is that aggression isn't the only option. When you're faced with these huge existential threats, there is another path you can take, the path to peace. So here's the crucial point. The theory of need-driven aggression wasn't necessarily wrong. It was just incomplete. It was missing the other half of the equation. Desperate times don't just call for desperate measures. Sometimes they call for radical cooperation, or what experts call accommodation. And the research shows there are three key conditions that make this path to peace possible. First, the leaders have to be committed to fixing huge problems at home, and they realize they just can't do that while fighting wars abroad. Second, they have to recognize that their old confrontational policies have failed and are just way too costly. And third, and this one is critical, they need to believe that if they offer peace, their adversary will respond in kind and not just take advantage of them. This quote from the Soviet foreign minister just perfectly captures that first condition. Mikhail Gorbachev's big goal was perestroika, restructuring the collapsing Soviet economy. To even have a chance at that, he absolutely needed a stable, peaceful world. The domestic need for reform is the engine driving the foreign policy of accommodation. And this pattern isn't a one-off thing, unique to the Soviets. Just look at this timeline. Egypt's Anwar Sadat first tried confrontation in 1973. When it proved way too costly, he pivoted to peace. Decades later, Gorbachev recognized that exact same lesson. The huge Soviet military buildup had failed, and because he was driven by his domestic agenda, he chose accommodation. And the Cold War came to an end. Okay, so that fundamental choice between aggression and accommodation is timeless. But what has changed are the tools. Today's leaders are operating in a much more complex landscape of power, with a whole modern toolkit for exerting their influence. Today's leaders have this whole spectrum of power to choose from. You've got your classic hard power, that's the military and economic muscle. Then there's soft power, the power of attraction, through culture and values. But the most effective leaders use smart power, which is strategically combining both to get what they want. And this is where so much of today's competition happens, in the gray zone. For a nation that's feeling that need for aggression, but wants to avoid the crazy high cost of open war, these tactics are the perfect tool.
They're aggressive actions designed to fly just under the radar of a full-blown military response.
And we can see right here how different powers use these gray zone tactics. China, for instance, often takes a more patient economic approach, using its maritime militia to slowly change the facts on the ground. Russia, on the other hand, tends to favor more aggressive, high-risk hybrid operations, like disinformation campaigns, all to destabilize its rivals.
So, all of this brings us right back to our central question. In this modern world of hard power, soft power, and gray zone conflict, nations still face that same fundamental choice. So, what are the big takeaways from all this? Well, we've learned that feeling cornered doesn't have to lead to war. It can, paradoxically, lead to peace. We've seen that a leader's domestic goals are often the real key to their foreign policy. We've understood that past failures can create future openings for cooperation. And finally, we see that this timeless choice between aggression and accommodation is now being played out with a whole new set of modern tools. And that leaves us with the big question for our time, doesn't it? As new pressures build on today's great powers, and as the memory of past failures begins to fade, will their leaders see the logic of accommodation, or will they feel that undeniable need for aggression? The path they choose will, without a doubt, define our future.